This video is brought to you by Nebula and TLDR's Race Across Europe. Over the last year or so, NATO has become increasingly interested in the Asia-Pacific. The alliance has been steadily developing its ties with its regional allies, especially Japan, Australia and South Korea. And last month, Japan announced that it was exploring the idea of opening a NATO office in Tokyo. This has become a point of contention within the alliance. Last week, Macron came out against the idea, arguing that NATO should remain focused on what he described as the North Atlantic region, and polling by the ECFR, released the same day, suggests the majority of Europeans don't want to get involved in Asia. So in this video, we're going to look at how NATO is expanding into Asia, why it's proved so controversial within the alliance, and whether it's actually a good idea. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a bit of context. As well as member states, NATO also has what it describes as partners, which engage in dialogue and cooperation with NATO, but are not actually members. According to NATO's website, it has 39 partners, and it uses this network to, quote, project stability and strengthening security outside NATO territory. Now, NATO doesn't have good relations with all these partners. Russia, for example, was technically a partner before the war in Ukraine, because it cooperated in the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council. But it does have good relations with its Asia partners, most notably Japan, South Korea, Australia, and, to a lesser extent, New Zealand. NATO established relations with Japan in the early 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when NATO was trying to reorient itself as a general Western alliance, instead of an anti-Soviet one, and established relations with Australia and South Korea in 2005. Relations have really stepped up in the last couple of years, as China has become more assertive in the Asia-Pacific, and the US has started focusing more on the region. In December 2020, foreign ministers from these 4 countries participated in a NATO foreign ministers meeting for the first time. Then, at the Brussels summit in June 2021, NATO agreed to increase practical cooperation between NATO and its partners in the Indo-Pacific. NATO's strategy document for 2022, the first to mention China, described China as a systemic challenge and pledged to strengthen NATO's dialogue and cooperation with new and existing partners in the Indo-Pacific. These moves towards the Asia-Pacific seem to be driven by the US, which is obviously pretty squarely focused on China, and NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, who's been worried about China for a while now. In an interview with the Financial Times in 2021, Stoltenberg argued that China was already impacting NATO's security, citing the trade war between China and Australia and spat between China and Lithuania earlier that year. Earlier this year, Stoltenberg went on a tour of the Asia-Pacific, and soon after, Japan announced plans for a NATO liaison office in Tokyo, the first in Asia. This was a step too far for French President Emmanuel Macron, who argued last week that NATO should not expand its reach beyond the North Atlantic, and that, quote, if we push NATO to enlarge the spectrum and the geography, we will make a big mistake. This comes a couple of months after Macron annoyed the US by suggesting on his way back from a state visit to Beijing that Europe shouldn't get involved in, quote, wars that aren't ours, i.e. Taiwan. As any new liaison office requires unanimous approval by all member states, this now means it's unlikely to happen. But this won't have gone down well with either Japan or the US, not least because Chinese state media immediately latched on to Macron's comments as proof of America's political isolation. Clearly, NATO's newfound interest in Asia has become a source of disagreement within the bloc. The US wants to pivot to the Asia-Pacific, but other NATO members, the most vocal being France, think that NATO should stay in the North Atlantic. So, who's right? Well, when Stoltenberg and Biden try to convince the rest of NATO to move into Asia, they usually make 3 arguments. First, Biden has argued in the past that the world is in a battle between democracies and autocracies, and that, as a pro-democracy group, NATO should push back against the world's main autocratic threat, which is China. Second, Stoltenberg and the US have argued that a war over Taiwan is fundamentally a global security threat, because it would have massive repercussions on the global economy and global geopolitics. So trying to deter Chinese aggression over Taiwan by expanding NATO's footprint in Asia is in NATO's interests. Third, Stoltenberg has argued that deeper cooperation with NATO's Asian partners could improve NATO's overall capabilities. South Korea, for example, is a world leader in cybersecurity, so deeper cooperation could improve NATO's overall cyber capabilities. These arguments just don't stack up for Macron. For starters, Macron and Europe more generally aren't keen on Biden's democracy versus autocracy framing, both because they're a bit more pragmatic when it comes to foreign relations, and because they can't afford to have bad relations with autocratic but economically significant countries. This is especially true when it comes to energy. Europe is currently trying to buddy up to various oil-rich autocracies, including Azerbaijan, Qatar and Algeria, to try and replace the shortfall created by the cutting off of Russian hydrocarbon imports. As a net energy exporter, the US doesn't have to worry about its energy security quite as much. But even then, Biden has recently been trying to mend relations with Saudi Arabia, one of the most autocratic countries in the world, to bring down global oil prices, which demonstrates the limitations of this democracy versus autocracy framing. On the second argument, Macron would agree that war over Taiwan is a global threat, but he'd see this as a reason not to expand into Asia, to avoid provoking further escalation by the Chinese. And while it might be true that closer cooperation with its Asian partners might improve NATO's overall capabilities, Macron would argue that you can still do this without annoying China or opening a liaison office in Tokyo. Finally, Macron has also argued that NATO needs to focus squarely on Russia for the time being, and expanding into Asia could push China into sending arms to Russia or lend credence to Putin's narrative that he was forced into Ukraine by NATO's expansion, which would hinder Europe's diplomatic efforts with the global south. Interestingly, polling suggests that most of Europe shares Macron's wariness over involvement in Asia. 62% of Europeans want their country to stay neutral in a US-China conflict over Taiwan, including pluralities in every country polled, while just 23% want their country to support the US. Similarly, a plurality of Europeans see China as a necessary partner rather than a rival or an adversary. So what do you think? Do you think NATO should follow the US into Asia, or is this a needlessly provocative distraction from the real threat, which is still Russia? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. There's also some other huge news, by the way. We've just launched our new series, TLDR's Race Across Europe. Take a look.
To celebrate the 10,000th order from the TLDR merch store, we committed to hand-delivering orders to a bunch of real TLDR fans. So, we split into 3 teams, assigned points to each delivery location on the map, and let teams try to score as many points as they could in just 30 hours. The problem? Well, only one team is allowed to make each delivery, and any team which doesn't make it to the location of the 10,000th order by the end of the game is disqualified. Welcome to TLDR's Race Across Europe.
I'm a speed demon now.
Why is British transport the worst?
Oh no! I'm going to be fuming if they beat us this one.
Zach is obviously thinking, he's like, nah, Ben's not a threat, nah, you know?
It's gonna look like it is when we lose.
Have you spoken to any other teams?
Guys, it's not looking good.
And thank you for ruining our journey. This is the worst thing that could have happened.
And I wouldn't put it past him, he's a spiteful little...
What? What do you mean? What? How does that happen? We've come through some kind of police barricade.
Genuinely very much an open question as to whether or not Jack gets back to the UK anytime soon.
Yeah.
It was within an hour.
That's not possible. Did you have a ticket? Who's got the tickets? Oh, I'm so sorry.
Now, you can watch the first episode on the TLDR EU channel right now, but we're also releasing every subsequent episode a week early on Nebula. So if you're a Nebula subscriber, you can watch the first 2 episodes right now, totally ad-free. That's true of all TLDR content, by the way. We regularly release our videos on Nebula before they come to YouTube, and everything's ad-free, so not even this advert is here. It's not just the race either. Every week, TLDR produces well over an hour's worth of content, which is exclusively for Nebula. That's exclusive discussions where our team share their thoughts on the latest stories, extended daily briefings, our Nebula series This Week in Parliament, and even full explainers. So if you want the full TLDR experience, you really ought to be on Nebula. Sign up now using our link in the description to get everything the platform has to offer for just £2 a month.